Hello, this is Rob Chadwick with ADL, and this is the sixth in a series of tutorials on using the Virtual World Framework sandbox application to build content. This lesson is titled Primitives and Object Properties, and we're going to look at exactly that. Now, in some of the previous lessons, we've been selecting objects and copy and paste and grouping and things like that, and we've been making a bunch of spheres and boxes. Well, those spheres and boxes are what we call primitive shapes. Up at the top of the screen, there's a list of the 5 possible primitive shapes, and there will be more primitive shapes in the future. If anybody out there in the open source community is a software developer and is interested in adding some of these, we have a nice pluggable architecture to kind of create more primitive object shapes. I'm going to go ahead and just create one of each: sphere, cube, cylinder, cone, and plane. Now, these are not all the shapes you can create with this system. But that's the basics of each shape, and then they're kind of modifiable. So those are your primitive shapes. There's not that much to it, right? But every object in this system exposes what we call object properties. If you remember, I'm going to select by clicking the select button here and grab, let's grab the plane. No, let's grab the cone. The cone has some kind of interesting properties. I'm going to use my transform tool to pull it up out of the ground so we can see it. And I'm going to hit the button here for the Object Properties window. Now, all objects in this system, not just the primitives, have object properties. Most objects have a transform property. This is very similar to the transform tool. And if I type in here, I can actually set the position, rotation, and scale for an object. Now look here as I turn around the x-axis, and these boxes are all x, y, z, x, y, z. That's a pretty typical convention. I'm rotating around the x, or the y, or of course the z. Right, so it spins like a top because it's spinning on the z, just like we saw in the lesson on transforms. However, this is nifty because if I want to set it to a particular point in space, or if I've selected it but I've lost it, well, for instance, I've stuck it down beneath the ground, right? Like now it's way down here. Well, how do I get it? I can, let me deselect, right? I can region select to grab it, open the Object Properties window, and now I can type in a transformation, and I can just push it back up so I can grab it. So, objects have transform properties in the Object Properties window that you can type in. They've got flags. This, in this case, has a name that I can display. I can just type a different name here, and everywhere in this system you'll see it referred to as this different name. I'm going to keep it with Cone 1 at this point. You'll note also it's owned by me because I'm logged in as Rob. Don't worry too much about that. We'll talk about permissions and things in another lesson. Finally, you'll see kind of a tab rollout here of primitive Cone 1. Each of these primitive objects, and let me select a few of them. You'll see here primitive sphere, here primitive cylinder, here primitive plane. Each of them exposes a set of properties that you can manipulate. So if I open this up and I grab the slider, this cone has a height. And you'll see exactly how that behaves. If I pull the height up and down, it modifies the kind of scale of the object. You'll note that this is technically different than doing a non-uniform scale on the z-axis. The scale, if I turn this height up, the scale transform is still 1, 1, 1, or close enough to 1, 1, 1. There's some rounding errors. There's another interesting property here I can change, and all of the dimensions of each of these objects allows you to change the segments. Watch how the cone gets to be a very low resolution. Look at this big blocky edge. All right? Or it gets to have a very high resolution as I turn the number of segments up. Now it's got a very high resolution. You can do something very similar with the sphere. Let me pull the sphere up so we can look at it. And I'll open the modifiers here, or not the modifiers, the properties. The sphere only has segments in one orientation, but it's also got a radius. So I can blow the whole sphere up, but I'll keep it about the same size. And I can turn down the resolution of the sphere, and you'll see this very blocky edge. Whoops, just deselected there. Or I can turn this, I can even click down, but it won't go down. It's the limit. Or I can pull this up and get a very smooth-edged sphere. Now, the number of polygons that make up a shape is not terribly important at this stage, but later I'm going to show you how to create geometry modifiers, and those geometry modifiers will operate on the primitive objects mesh, and the mesh needs to have a lot of polygons for some of those. So let me just look over a couple others. There's the cylinder here. The cylinder has height, height segments and a radius and radial segments, right? I can actually turn it all the way down until it's kind of a pyramid, right? Or turn it all the way up until it's got 20 segments going around, and similar. Other objects in the system will say something like modifier and have a little rollout on the side here. Most of the interacting that you do with objects in the system, most of those things that you can change will have some kind of GUI that will appear in the object properties window. Also, I should note that this object properties window, this is kind of a tray of different tools. Currently, I've got object properties open, but if I open the material editor, it'll pop into the same tray. And then if I hit X, it'll just show the object properties. If there are no tools open in the tray will just disappear on its own. You can also open it manually. Of course, there's nothing in the tray. And I can just slide it back and forth with this button. Of course, if you deselect things, there we go, it'll hide all the tools, and so the tray will disappear. So that's very basic geometry, creating some simple shapes and tweaking their properties, and a quick look at the object properties window. Also, transform type-ins, very useful if you want to position things precisely.